Hello everyone, Dr. Turner here, and this video is intended to help you write a kick-ass SLO and also make the case for why you want a kick-ass SLO. Now you should have watched the other video first because it's going to set you up for what an SLO is. So if you haven't watched that other one, scoot up, watch it first, come back to this one, and we'll move ahead. So what is this thing called an SLO and why should you care? Right? So, an SLO is a student learning outcome. Now, outcomes are more immediate. So if you're thinking about a goal, especially a long-range goal, what that means is you want to, say, win a race. But in order to do that, maybe you've got to clear a hurdle that's right in front of you. So what we're going to focus on in this video is those immediate goals, like what's right in front of you. Eventually, you want students to, I hope, be critical thinkers, to be creative, to be able to understand history and how it still plays out in the modern world, those kinds of things, those big, broad goals. But if you can't write the short-term ones, you don't get to the long-term ones. So an SLO is a short range, often after one lesson, episode of learning, episode of assessment, where you can see if your students have got it. So in order to make sure they've got it, you have to be really specific. So here we go. Last video, I talked a little bit about the difference between these two things. Learning objectives over there on the left being broad and tied to the instructor, like I will lecture on the Great Depression and students will take notes. Notice that's not really easily measurable. What we want to focus on is the learning outcomes on the right. Those are tied to specific student behaviors that can be measured. So students compare salaries from humans in 1930 before and after the collapse of the stock market. Whoops, 29, sorry. So those are specific, those on the right. And what's great about writing a really specific outcome is now you have a target. You're not just flying around South Dakota wondering where you should land. So we're going to create targets. We're going to avoid teacher-centered language. We do this a lot in education. We like to talk about what we're going to do. I'm going to do this. I'm going to make a PowerPoint. I'm going to blah, blah, blah. Well, at the end of the day, that's really, it's not about you. It's what the students can do, what the students know or can do as a result of that. So the emphasis is always on students. So here we go. I mentioned also that there's this typical assessment process, in which we find something out of our curriculum and we're like, okay, we've got to talk about how the North American continent changed because of exploration. And let's see, maybe something that could kind of hit that goal is maybe we'll establish some background knowledge and then we'll read an article called Westward Ho, and then I will grade those. They'll answer questions at the end and I'll grade those, right? Very typical, not very effective. And so I suggested last video that we change this to setting your curriculum goal. Okay, I still want to know if students can talk about how North America changed through exploration and conflict, but I'm going to stop and think about what I want students to know and do. Like before I decide on instruction, I need to know what they are going to say and do, how they're going to show it to me. So I might say, you know what, students are going to identify an immigrant from a PBS article and write a diary from their point of view. How did their move impact themselves and others? Or maybe even the place. Now notice, that's going to have a high degree of validity because it's very relevant to that standard, that curriculum goal. But it also helps me think about, like, okay, if I want them to read primary sources and imagine themselves back in time and how this place has changed, now I know what to teach. Now I'm going to provide the background knowledge they need, not a whole bunch of baloney that maybe they don't need. I'm going to be selective about the primary sources that I pick. And I'm going to think about how that they can show me, I can ask them to do some perspective taking. And I also mentioned how assignments like this have more degree of transferability because we often send messages to other people. We often stop to think about our circumstances. We write. So, in this more effective assessment process, what you must know is this is your SLO. This middle part where you say, students identify an immigrant they want to take a look at, they write a diary from their point of view, and they answer this question. That's an SLO. That's all it is. It's one sentence, and it can be the hardest sentence because you really have to be clear on what you want. Let me show you some bad ones so you can see what they look like. So, fun with SLOs. This was, if I had you in class, I'd be asking you to put up little red or green signs, depending on if you think this is effective or not. So you can pause the video if you want to play along. But if you looked at this one, students will listen to a lecture on graphing linear equations. Well, if you stop to think about it, I guess we know what students are going to do. But what's missing? Well, I'm going to tell you right now. There's no way to measure what they know. So you can, and it's impossible to know if somebody's listening to you. So I can be giving this lecture right here, right now, online. Are you listening to it? Nope. Your head's in the fridge and you know it. So listening is something we can't measure. So I'm going to go through a few criteria. And since you're going to write an SLO this week, so that I can see you can set a very specific goal that you can get your airplane to that goal, I'm going to give you some more examples. So here's one. After watching a demonstration, students will graph linear equations. Well, that was a little bit better. It's not real specific. I don't know what degree of accuracy the students have to do that, but it's better, right? So sometimes we call these SMART goals because the S, the M, the A, R, and T all stand for something. So the first thing is specific. You want your goal to be really specific. This is where it's not, I'm flying to the Midwest. You're flying to Clyde Ice Field. This is where you make it specific. So this one is not. Students take notes on the stock market crash. Okay, that's really not specific. I mean, we know what the notes are about, but we don't know what they're doing. We don't know what the form of those notes are. Are they comparing? Are they contrasting? What are they looking at in particular? So better, more clear, more demonstrating that you know where you want to land is by the end of the lesson, students will create a graphic organizer showing the causes of the stock market crash of 1929. Now notice that's more narrowed down. We're just looking at a few causes of something, which seems to be creepily relevant right now, right? So they have to be specific, right? The next one is M, which is measurable. So this one, students will appreciate art by observing it in a museum, is not measurable because you can never measure appreciation. Even if you ask students to write down what you appreciated, you can fake appreciation because it's one of those performative things that we do because you're like, oh, I know my teacher really loves this shit, so I'm going to appreciate it a heap, right? So that's not measurable. I can't give you a score and shouldn't give you a score on how well you appreciated something. But I can, after attending the art museum, students will identify 5 different painting techniques used by 5 different artists. That I can measure, that I can look at a piece of paper, see a student behavior, and know if they were able to do that. So that, my friend, is measurable. So A is for attainable. This means that students have to be able to do it in the time frame you set. So you don't get to say something like, by the end of this lesson, students will create a PowerPoint presentation that discusses the Spanish Civil War and all of its implications, because you can do that in 45 minutes. So you want to make sure that it's something you can achieve, that it's not students, explain God, the universe, and everything after 3 minutes of a video, right? So also notice this one's not only attainable, well, the teacher can do it. Notice that students will be put into groups as something a teacher does, right? So that's not even something students can attain, right? So if I, as a teacher, put students in groups, I allow that they are going to collaborate to solve geography problems. Now, notice this one isn't highly specific, but at least it's saying what students are going to do. They're going to solve the geography problems. R is relevant. This means it needs to be relevant to that standard. So if I want students to look at the effects of migration in America, I can't really give an assignment that's like, hey, look at propaganda posters from 1930. I mean, you might be able to tie those two things together, but you really want to make sure that what you're asking students to do corresponds with that standard. So students will get a lesson that's vague and terrible. During the class, students will use the internet to locate 5 reliable sources on Karl Marx. So notice that in order to really tell if this is right, my standard in history would have to have something to do with understanding probably socialism or communism, right? So this needs to be, R is for relevant. The relevance also makes this valid, right? Okay, and it's time bound. So when is that behavior going to occur? Is it that students are going to agree and disagree with a character decision after chapter 1? Is it after they view a short clip, they will be able to analyze for trustworthiness? So the time bound is when it occurs. So students, this one has no time bound. It's like students will evaluate the impact of human activity on specific watersheds. Okay, when? So at the end of reading the article, students will evaluate the impact of human activity on specific watersheds. So just say when. Like, when is it going to occur? What is the behavior? What is specifically, what will you be looking for? What form will it take? Because you want to know that sentence is going to determine what you ask students to do. So the last thing I want to show you is how you can write these, how Bloom's can help you write these, right? Because we want them to be attainable, and we want them to be relevant, and we want them to be time-bound. But what language do we use? And this is designed to help you here. If you have a student's list identify label, you're asking them in your student outcome to perform something toward the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, and that is fine. So it may be that you want them to label some of the generals or some of the military personnel who were involved in the Vietnam War, right? Maybe we just label first. Maybe we say, what was the cause and effect between two things? Use these words. Use the word summarize, use the word describe, use the word predict or associate or discuss. The reason why I'm asking you to do that is because these words that are associated with the cognitive levels on Bloom's actually give you behaviors you can see and measure. So they help you avoid that. Students will be put into groups, kind of like non-useful stuff. So the reason why I'm adding the Bloom's in here is for you to take these verbs. What would you like students to do with that after you've talked about high and low pressure? Students demonstrate the difference between high and low pressure by building paper airplanes and explaining the airflow, right? Use the words. Use demonstrate, calculate, illustrate, relate. Use the words. Are we going to analyze? We're going to take something apart, dissect, separate, arrange, infer, order. Use the words from Bloom's to help you think about what you want students to do, what the behavior you want to see by the end of the class is. Like, you want them to land at Clyde Ice Airfield and nowhere else, right? So you want to use these words that are very clearly action-driven. So examine, rank, grade, test, create is invent, prepare, generalize. Use these verbs. And now I have this PowerPoint lecture in the PowerPoint area on the modules, but you can also use this video if you're like, I don't really know how to write one of these. just go through these. See, really think about how these verbs can help you. And if you really want to crush this, start with the easy ones. Always start at the bottom of Bloom's. Like identify two founding fathers before saying what they did or how they differed, how they were similar and different, who was more effective, and what would make a better leader. So I would always start here, just recall, because you've got to establish background knowledge. Remember that we build knowledge. We build it from holding on to something we know and building something that we can hook onto that. So when you're using Bloom's, in these SLOs, start with one of these. Students will identify. Students will say how and why in order to evaluate an action. So you can actually, you don't have to use all of the levels of Bloom's. Please don't. You'll make yourself bananas. But I would suggest that you try one of the lower ones in order to get to something else, right? So, as we move forward, just really think. Use the language that's right out here before you. You can use your own language too, but sometimes it helps just to have some of the language spelled out as you're writing these like mysteriously hard sentences that are specific and measurable and time-bound and relevant. Okay, so these are the same directions that were at the end of your last video, but this video just explains this third one. Oh, look, there's the end slide. So, looking forward to your work this week. I hope you're staying well. Bye.